In 2012, a laser scan of the jungle beside the most visited temple on Earth found 6 giant spirals cut into the ground, each one a kilometer wide, raised by hand in the 1100s. Archaeologists dug in expecting tools, pottery, the ash of old fires. They found bare sand. The 2 men who led the dig said it without hedging. They still do not know what these spirals are, and nothing shaped like them exists anywhere else on Earth. In this video, 10 medieval buildings that broke the engineering of their own century, and the strangest one is last. Number 10. The Great Mosque of Kilwa Kisiwani. Off the southern coast of what is now Tanzania, a wall rises straight out of a low coral island, its pale stone catching the ocean light at the edge of the water. The strange part is that the wall itself used to be alive. Kilwa Kisiwani sits in warm, shallow water on the Swahili coast of East Africa. It holds some of the oldest surviving stone architecture on that entire coastline. The earliest coral construction on the island dates back to the end of the 900s. The oldest surviving prayer hall of the Great Mosque, a room of 16 bays carried on 9 slender columns, is usually placed in the 11th or 12th century. Later, in the early 1300s, under a ruler named Sultan al-Hassan ibn Sulayman, the mosque received a huge southern extension crowned with the first true dome ever raised on this stretch of coast. Not one name, of a single architect or builder, survives from any phase of the work. In 1331, a traveler from Morocco named Ibn Battuta stepped off a ship onto Kilwa and walked straight into one of the richest cities he had ever seen. He stayed as a guest of the royal court, and later described a ruler so generous that once, right after Friday prayers, a poor petitioner asked him for the clothes off his back, and the Sultan simply took off his own robe and handed it over, on the spot, in front of everyone. He wrote about gold arriving from mines deep in the interior, and about a harbor so wealthy that its coral walls felt less like a shelter and more like a boast. Ships came in from India and Arabia loaded with cloth and glass, and left loaded with gold, ivory, and human beings. Vessels from China arrived carrying porcelain, and some of that porcelain never left the island at all. Broken shards of it were pressed straight into the wet mortar of the mosque ceiling while builders worked, centuries before anyone thought to write any of this down. Pieces of blue and white china are still visible today, embedded in the vault above worshippers' heads, a trade route frozen directly overhead in stone. Here is the part that feels strange without needing any myth to make it strange, because the plain, documented facts already carry the tension by themselves. The coral used for these walls was never quarried the way ordinary stone is quarried. Workers waded into the shallows and cut it straight out of the living reef, while it was still soft enough to shape with simple hand tools, almost like cutting through wet chalk. Only after it was hauled out of the water and left exposed to open air did it slowly harden into the pale, dense stone still standing today. The builders here worked in the reverse order of nearly every other stone mason in this story, shaping their material before it had even finished turning into stone. Then they simply waited for the walls to finish becoming what they were always going to be. Historians argue hard over exactly when each section of Kilwa was raised. A local chronicle written centuries after the fact does not agree with coin evidence dug up in the 1960s and 70s. New radiocarbon dating, carried out as recently as 2016 and 2022, does not fully agree with either of them. The true sequence of construction is still an open, active argument among historians. Even the chronicle itself was written down long after the events it claims to describe, which is exactly why archaeologists keep returning to coins and radiocarbon samples instead of trusting the text alone. There is also a founding legend, still told on the island today, claiming that the ruling dynasty descended from Persian princes who sailed across the sea from the Persian Gulf to found the city. Most historians now treat that story as a legitimizing myth rather than a real migration. That means the true origin of the people who actually built Kilwa has never been firmly settled. But the deepest question here is not who built it, or even exactly when. It is how a building made of living reef, carved soft and hardened after the fact, has managed to stand at all for roughly 700 years. The stone is fragile by nature. Conservators have been racing since 2008 just to keep these walls from dissolving back into the very coastline they were cut from. Kilwa's ruins are protected today as a World Heritage Site, which has not stopped the coral from slowly crumbling. The real mystery here is not a secret waiting to be uncovered somewhere underground. It is a slow vanishing act happening in plain sight, and every year the evidence that could finally settle the argument grows a little softer, a little closer to washing away for good. Kilwa's mystery, in the end, is a quiet one, more erosion than enigma. Stone that had no business surviving has somehow barely survived, and the clock on that survival is already running. What comes next is the opposite kind of mystery entirely. Nobody in Europe struggled to explain how a mound of coral hardened into a wall. Instead, people looked at bridges thrown across impossible gorges and raging rivers, and decided that human hands alone could not possibly be responsible. Number 9. The Devil's Bridges. Across medieval Europe, the same story gets told again and again, in different languages, about different rivers, and it always ends the same way. A bridge appears that looks too good to have been built by ordinary men, so the people living nearby decide a demon must have built it instead. Versions of the same basic tale turn up from the Swiss Alps to the hills of Wales, wherever medieval builders solved a river crossing that looked like it should have been physically impossible for its time. Folklorists actually track this recurring pattern as its own category, filed under story type 1191, in the standard index they use for classifying legends, sometimes summarized simply as the devil acting as bridge builder. 3 crossings stand out as the strongest examples of this pattern. High in the Swiss Alps, in the narrow Skalanen gorge carved by the Reuss River, a bridge known as the Teufelsbrug, meaning the Devil's Bridge, first crossed the gorge around 1230. It hung over a drop where the water below roars loud enough to drown out conversation. Later versions replaced it in 1595, again in 1830, and once more in 1958. In the French town of Cahors, on the river lot, the Pont Vaillanter was begun in 1308, opened to foot and cart traffic by 1350, and had the whole bridge, towers included, finished by 1378. It is protected today as a World Heritage Site. In Tuscany, local tradition says the Pont della Madonna was first ordered by a countess named Matilda of Canossa sometime in the 11th or 12th century. The bridge in its current shape, though, is most likely a rebuilding from the early 1300s. Even Italy's own heritage authorities describe that date as probable rather than certain. In every one of these 3 cases, the name of the actual builder has been lost to time. Here is what needs to be said plainly and on the record. The devil did not build any of these bridges. That part is legend, not history, and it deserves to be labeled as legend rather than fact. The written record actually helps prove the point. The name Teufelsbrug for the Swiss bridge is not recorded in writing until 1587. That means the bridge stood as an ordinary piece of engineering for more than 300 years before anyone wrote down a story about the devil building it. For 3 centuries, it seems, nobody needed the devil to explain a bridge at all. So if the devil is fiction, what is real underneath the legend? And why did people reach for a supernatural explanation at all? The honest answer is that these were 3 of the hardest engineering problems of their age, solved so well that they looked impossible. The Swiss bridge over Skalanen Gorge was, for centuries, the only crossing over an otherwise impassable alpine chasm, sitting on the main trade route over the St. Gotthard Pass between northern and southern Europe. The French bridge at Cahors took an unusually long 70 years to complete, with 3 towers rising 40 meters over a crossing 138 meters long. The Italian bridge has a profile people still find hard to believe in person, a lopsided hump sometimes called a donkey's back. Its main arch spans almost 38 meters, while the roadway across it stays barely wide enough for a single loaded cart. It still looks, even today, like it is breaking the rules of balance. Standing underneath any of the 3, looking straight up at all that stacked stone holding itself in place over open air and rushing water, it becomes easy to understand something. Medieval villagers reached for a supernatural explanation, instead of crediting the quiet, human skill of a master mason nobody bothered to name. This is where the real, ongoing argument actually lies. Historians and engineers are genuinely divided, not about the devil, but about the true construction history of these bridges. How much of what stands today is original medieval work, and how much is later rebuilding disguised as restoration, is still argued case by case, stone by stone. Here is the detail that undercuts the whole legend hardest of all. On top of the central tower of the Pont Valentin stands a small carved devil, reaching out of the stonework as if he is prying loose the very keystone that holds the tower together. It is the single most photographed image people point to as proof of the story. That statue was carved by a sculptor named Common in 1879, added during a 19th century restoration. The most famous piece of evidence for a medieval demon is, in reality, younger than the United States. So the deeper unease here is not that the devil built a bridge. Obviously, he did not. It is that an entire culture watched real human beings solve a genuinely brutal engineering problem, and instead of remembering their names, chose to hand the credit to a demon. The myth was then reinforced, stone by stone, centuries later, until fiction and fact became almost impossible to pull apart just by looking. A mystery can survive simply because people refuse to believe humans were clever enough. Wait until you see a ceiling that still makes structural engineers argue today, not about legend, but about the actual mathematics holding the stone up. Number 8. The fan vault of King's College. Picture a stone ceiling that looks like dozens of open fans, carved from solid rock, spreading wide overhead until the whole roof seems to be made of lace rather than stone. Light falls through tall windows and catches every ridge of the carving. That shape was born in the east walk of the cloister at Gloucester Cathedral, raised sometime between roughly 1351 and 1377, under a master mason named Thomas of Cambridge. That Cambridge is a small village in Gloucestershire, not the university city that shares its name. The largest and most famous version of that idea would not appear for another century and a half, in the chapel of King's College in Cambridge. It is a room so long and so tall inside that visitors instinctively lower their voices the moment they step through the door. It was built between 1512 and 1515 by master mason John Wassell, funded by 2 kings in succession, Henry VII and his son Henry VIII. That ceiling spans 12.7 meters from wall to wall, the widest fan vault ever raised anywhere. This is the strongest mystery on this entire list, because it is not built on rumor. It rests on a genuine, well-documented gap in the historical record, and that gap comes in 2 separate, honest parts. The first question is simply how medieval masons designed geometry this precise without algebra, and without any formal calculation of load or stress, centuries before either existed as a mathematical tool. Not one original drawing survives for either Gloucester or King's College. What we do know is that masons worked directly with compasses on specially prepared floors, scratching out full-scale plans in plaster or stone. One rare surviving example of exactly this kind of tracing floor still exists at Wells Cathedral. Its surface is still scored with faint compass arcs, full-scale patterns for vault ribs that were never meant to remain visible once the actual stone went up. When modern researchers, including an engineer and historian named Jacques Heyman, published a reconstruction of the design method in 2018, that reconstruction was built by carefully measuring the finished stone centuries later. It is a scientific best guess drawn from the surviving object, not a rediscovered instruction manual. The second question concerns the physics of the ceiling itself, and here is where people often repeat a piece of folklore that simply is not true. There is no hidden wooden skeleton holding this stone ceiling up. Timber does exist above these vaults, but it belongs to the roof structure sitting on top, holding up lead and slate against the weather, with no structural connection to the stone fan pattern below it. The real answer is stranger than that myth. Engineers largely worked out the basic mechanics decades ago, describing the fan vault as behaving like a thin stone shell rather than a simple arch. And yet a peer-reviewed paper published in 2021, in the Proceedings of the Royal Society, reached a very different conclusion. Its author, engineer Catalin Boggi, states plainly that the mechanics of fan vaults still raise several real questions, and most of them remain unanswered. That includes exactly what role the loose rubble packed above the shell plays, and precisely how weight moves through the stone down to the columns below. This is not settled history. It is an open engineering question today. Here is the detail worth sitting with. The stone shell of this ceiling is only 12 to 15 centimeters thick, stretched across a gap of almost 13 meters. The engineers writing that 2021 paper reached for the same comparison anyone would, an eggshell. At the center of the pattern hangs a carved stone pendant, a decorative drop keystone weighing around 1.5 tons, appearing to float in open space in the middle of the design. Stand underneath and look up, and that weight seems to hang from nothing at all, held in place by geometry alone. It has hung there without falling for more than 500 years. The unsettling part is not that the ceiling might fall. It has stood for 5 centuries and shows no sign of giving up now. The unsettling part is that trained structural engineers, with modern software and complete freedom to measure every stone, still cannot fully explain why it works. Every honest paper on the subject ends with more open questions than closed ones. Every visitor walking beneath it today stands underneath an argument engineers have not finished having. Sometimes the scariest kind of mystery is not the one hidden by missing records. It is the one sitting in plain daylight, fully measured, fully visible, and still not completely understood. The next stop takes that same unease and buries it on purpose, because the next structure was not simply left unexplained by time. Its builders appear to have hidden part of the story themselves, sealing away carvings underneath their own temple before anyone outside ever saw them. Number 7. Borobudur. In the Kedu Valley of central Java, in what is now Indonesia near Yogyakarta, a stepped stone mountain rises out of the landscape, and it was never a mountain at all. It is Borobudur, the largest Buddhist monument on earth, raised sometime between 760 and 830, under a Buddhist royal line known as the Sailendra dynasty. Not one stone at the site carries an inscription naming who ordered it built, or when the first block was set in place. Historians reconstruct the date sideways, from the handwriting of nearby royal charters and the carving style of the reliefs. Picture the shape of it. Borobudur is not a building with rooms and doorways. It is a stepped pyramid built like a mandala, rising level by level in stone terraces, crowned at the top by rows of bell-shaped domes, each one holding a carved Buddha visible only through a small opening. Wrapped around every terrace are 2,672 carved relief panels, an entire scripture cut into rock, meant to be read on foot in a slow spiral climb toward enlightenment. The whole mountain is built from somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million blocks of volcanic andesite, fitted together like an interlocking puzzle. Not one drop of mortar holds any of it in place. That puzzle is the first real mystery here. No one has ever pinpointed the original quarry that supplied 2 million blocks of stone, and no ledger or worker's tally has survived to explain how the labor was organized. You may hear 75 years quoted as the build time. Treat that carefully. It is a scholarly estimate, not a number carved into any surviving record. An entire mountain of fitted stone rose out of this valley, and the workforce that raised it left no paperwork at all. But the deeper mystery at Borobudur is not what its builders raised. It is what they chose to bury. Around the base of the monument, hidden beneath an extra layer of stone added sometime in antiquity, sit 160 carved relief panels known as the Karmawibhanga, illustrating the Buddhist law of karma, sin followed by punishment, in graphic detail. Someone in the ancient past chose to wall that base back up, hiding them from every visitor who would climb the mountain after them. They stayed hidden for centuries, until 1885, when an engineer named Azerman noticed the buried foot of the monument did not match the rest of the structure and had it opened. Between 1890 and 1891, every panel was uncovered and photographed for the record, one by one. Then the people who found them did something more unsettling than the original burial. They sealed the reliefs back up. On purpose, the same hands that freed those carvings from their stone tomb returned them to it. Historians still genuinely disagree about why. The scholar Jan Fontaine rejected a purely symbolic explanation. Johann de Casparis weighed two theories against each other: that the carved base was structurally unsound and needed buttressing, or that the panels were hidden on purpose, their sin-soaked imagery judged unfit for a monument built toward enlightenment, argued by the historian Willem Stutterheim. De Casparis himself admitted neither explanation was fully convincing. A second dispute sits beside it. No one is certain why Borobudur was abandoned, sometime between the 10th and the 15th centuries, with rival theories pointing to an eruption of the volcano Merapi, an eastward shift of the royal court, or the region's slow conversion to Islam. The honest scholarly answer is still, quite simply, that nobody knows. Here is the detail worth sitting with. 160 carved scenes of sin and consequence, hidden by human hands, found by accident, fully documented by camera, then hidden again by the very people holding the photographic proof of what was under the stone. Today, more than a century later, only 4 panels at the southeast corner of that buried level have ever been reopened for visitors. The remaining 156 stay sealed inside the stone at this moment, exactly as the people who covered them chose to leave it. Be honest about one claim you may have heard elsewhere. The idea that nobody knows who built Borobudur simply is not true, and repeating it does the real mystery a disservice. The Sailendra dynasty's patronage is well documented in surrounding inscriptions. What is genuinely unknown is the why of the silence, why a civilization confident enough to move 2 million stones chose, at the very end, to bury its own carved reckoning with sin, and that should trouble you more than any curse or conspiracy. This was not a mystery imposed on Borobudur from outside, by time or looters. It was a mystery its own builders manufactured with their own hands and then walked away from. What does it mean that the people who built a mountain out of scripture chose, quite deliberately, to bury the one part of it that judged them? Borobudur's riddle is a mystery of concealment, stone stacked over stone to hide something rather than to hold something up. On the other side of the world, on a hillside above the Andes, the very same trick, stone fitted to stone without a trace of mortar, produces the opposite kind of mystery. Nobody hid anything there. The wall stands in plain sight, and engineers still cannot fully agree on how stones that size were ever moved into place. Number 6. Sacsayhuamán. On a hilltop above Cuzco, high in the Peruvian Andes, stands a wall unlike almost anything else in the medieval world. This is Sacsayhuamán, raised under the Inca Emperor Pachacutec and the rulers who followed him, Tupac Inca Yupanqui and Huayna Capac, across the second half of the 15th century into the early 16th. The hill itself was already settled centuries earlier, occupied from around the year 900 by an earlier culture called the Kilk. The labor that raised these walls came through the Mida, a rotating public duty owed to the empire by its own citizens, not slavery, work paid back in shifts. Picture the wall itself. Three-tiered ramparts climb the hillside in a long zigzag, built from stones so massive that a grown man standing beside the largest looks like a child beside a house. Every block is a different size and shape, yet each one is fitted so precisely against its neighbors that the seam between them is barely a hairline. No mortar binds any of it. Try to slide a knife or even a sheet of paper into one of these joints. It will not go in. Centuries of rain and 2 catastrophic earthquakes have not opened those seams. The mystery here honestly splits into 3 parts. The first is genuinely open and unsolved. Some of the largest blocks are estimated to weigh between 100 and 200 tons, and this culture had no wheel and no draft animals for hauling weight like that. The likely method, log rollers, earthen ramps, and simple levers, was tested and proven to work, but only on a 15-ton block. In a 1997 documentary for the public television science series Nova, nobody has ever tried that experiment at the true scale of the largest stones here. So exactly how the real giants moved remains an honest, open question. The second part is not really a mystery anymore. The famous knife-tight fit between the stones was recreated by an architectural historian named Jean-Pierre Pratzen, published in 1985 in the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians. Pratzen fitted stones together himself with nothing but simple stone hammers, through patient trial and error, until each block married perfectly with the one beside it. No lost technology and no vanished science were required. Skill, patience, and time explain the fit completely. The third part is being actively studied right now, and it may be the strangest of the 3. These walls survived a major earthquake in 1650 and another in 1950, both of which tore apart Spanish colonial buildings standing on those same foundations. A peer-reviewed paper published in 2024 in the journal Engineering Failure Analysis built a computer model of the wall's behavior in an earthquake. It confirms the polygonal, unmortared joints genuinely outperform mortared masonry when the ground shakes, but the exact geometric reason is still being worked out, not fully settled. Engineers with modern software are still catching up to a solution Andean masons reached 500 years ago. Here is the detail worth sitting with. Colonial-era chroniclers recorded one single block that never made it to the wall. They gave it a name of its own, in the Spanish of the period, Piedra Cansada, meaning the tired stone. The block broke loose while being hauled up the hillside, rolled and crushed the workers pulling it, and it was left exactly where it stopped. That is not just legend. Archaeologists have confirmed blocks left stranded mid-transport at the related site of Ollantaytambo, giving the story real physical evidence. Sit with the deeper unease underneath this. We treat the unsolved transport question as the real mystery here, and it is. But the more unsettling fact is the one already proven. When the ground shook hard enough to tear apart European buildings raised with mortar and iron right next door, the unmortared Inca wall barely moved. These builders solved a structural problem that modern engineering, with all its steel and computer modeling, is still working to fully explain. In a city sitting on active fault lines to this day. One honest warning before we move on. You may encounter claims that these stones were softened with plant sap, or poured into place like liquid stone, an early concrete disguised as masonry. Neither idea holds up. The plant sap story has never been confirmed in any laboratory, and the poured stone theory is contradicted by the geology of the blocks and by unfinished stones found abandoned mid-carving, still showing ordinary tool marks. Claims about ancient visitors from beyond this world belong in the same pile. The true answer, patient human skill multiplied across generations, is remarkable enough without inventing something stranger. Sacsayhuamán has already answered its earthquake question in the only way that counts. It is still standing after 5 centuries. On the far side of the medieval world, and centuries earlier, a far more delicate shape was asked that same question by a much larger and more crowded city, and the answer it received was nowhere near as reassuring. The next stop on this list balances an enormous dome of stone and brick over the heart of a capital built on one of the most dangerous fault lines on Earth. And even today, with scaffolding once again climbing its walls, engineers are still not entirely sure their answer will hold. Number 5. Hagia Sophia. It has stood for almost 1,500 years, and at this very moment, scaffolding wraps around its dome, because the engineers responsible for keeping it upright are not entirely certain how it will behave the next time the ground moves. In the heart of old Constantinople, the city the modern world knows as Istanbul, Emperor Justinian I ordered that church raised in the year 532. He did not hire architects to design it. He hired 2 mathematicians, Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, men trained in geometry, optics, and the mechanics of arches and levers, not in chapels or cathedrals. It was an unusual choice for its era, when most great churches rose out of craft knowledge passed down among master masons, not out of men who approached a roof the way they approached a theorem. In a little over 5 years, an almost impossibly short span for a building of this size, they covered an open hall wider than almost anything the ancient world had dared to roof in a single unbroken stretch, and crowned it with a dome that seemed to hang in the air above the heads of everyone standing beneath it. The whole site is recognized today as a World Heritage location, one of the most studied buildings on the planet. People who saw it finished struggled to describe what they were looking at. The historian Procopius, who stood inside it not long after it opened, wrote that the dome did not look as though it were resting on the walls at all. It looked, he said, as though it hung from the heavens themselves, suspended on a golden chain. That image is legend, not engineering, the reach of a 6th-century writer for poetry, because the mathematics in front of him had no plain word yet. The poetry did not survive long. Barely 20 years after the dome first rose, a chain of earthquakes struck the region in 557 and 558, and the first dome of Hagia Sophia came down. The empire rebuilt it almost immediately, this time steeper and more heavily ribbed, the work overseen by a second architect known to history as Isidore the Younger, likely a nephew of the original builder, correcting his elder's mistake in real time. The new dome was finished by 562, and it is that second dome, repaired and reinforced many times since, that still crowns the building today. Popular tradition adds a workforce to this story, 10,000 laborers, 100 master masons split into competing teams of 50, each side racing the other up opposite curves of the rising dome to see who could finish first. It is a wonderful image of ambition under pressure, the kind of detail that turns a construction site into a legend. No surviving contract or payroll actually confirms those figures, so hold them as inherited legend, not a verified headcount. Here is where the story turns uncomfortable. Istanbul sits directly on the North Anatolian Fault, one of the most active earthquake systems on the planet, and modern surveys have found that the dome's own supporting buttresses are not even symmetrical, one side of the building carrying its share of the load differently than the other. An uneven skeleton is harder to predict once the ground starts shaking than a balanced one, and no one has ever built a matching twin to test it against. Since 1991, a network of sensors has listened to the building around the clock and recorded dozens of separate seismic events moving through its stones. And that is exactly why, right now, workers are running the largest reinforcement campaign this building has seen in a century and a half, strengthening joints and connections that engineers openly admit they do not fully trust. A structural engineer who has studied the building for decades, speaking to Smithsonian Magazine, put it as plainly as a professional ever will. He said engineers just do not know how stable it is. And the most unsettling part of this story was never that one dome fell 15 centuries ago. It is that historians and engineers still cannot say, with full confidence, what that very first dome even looked like. It does not survive to be measured directly. Every reconstruction of it is built from a technique called finite-element modeling, computer simulation checked against Procopius's eyewitness account, and the team behind the most cited version of that model, publishing in the journal Soil Dynamics and Earthquake Engineering in 2009, described their own result, in their own published words, as the most probable reconstruction, not an established fact. A building this famous, standing in the middle of a modern city of millions, and the people who study it professionally will tell you on the record that both its original shape and its future survival remain open questions. If a landmark this studied, this photographed, this walked through by millions of visitors every year, can leave professional engineers this uncertain, imagine what waits in a place where nobody has ever installed a sensor, drawn a modern blueprint, or agreed on how the builders worked at all. Half a world away, scattered across a lagoon in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, stands a stone city that makes the puzzle of one uncertain dome look almost modest by comparison. Number 4. Nan Madol. Off the eastern coast of the island of Pohnpei, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, sits a city built almost entirely of stone columns that no living person has ever fully explained how to move. Small islet construction on this site goes back to roughly the year 900. But the monumental phase, the one visitors can still walk through today, dates to between 1180 and 1200, a span confirmed by uranium-thorium dating of coral fused directly into the stonework, precise enough to be published in a peer-reviewed journal called Quaternary Research. The builders belong to the Saudeleur dynasty, a line of rulers who governed Pohnpei from this single capital. The site is recognized as a World Heritage location and, in the same breath, listed among those most at risk of being lost. Picture a lattice of small artificial islands separated by tidal canals, so laced with waterways that visitors have long called it the Pacific's answer to Venice. Walk between the islets and you pass walls assembled entirely from naturally hexagonal columns of dark basalt rock, stacked without mortar, holding their shape and their silence for 800 years. Local founding legend says the whole city was raised by two sorcerer brothers, Alasipa and Alasopa, who called the stones out of the earth and set them flying into place, in some versions of the tale with the help of a dragon. It is a beautiful story, and it is explicitly a legend, not a survey report. What archaeologists have actually confirmed is, in its own way, just as strange, because it comes with no magic to hide behind. The hexagonal shape of the columns is explained. It is simple geology, the same natural cracking pattern that forms when thick lava cools slowly, the same process behind other famous basalt columns around the world. Researchers have even traced the source quarry to the Socays district, on the opposite side of Pohnpei from Nan Madol itself. What is not explained is everything that happened after the stone left the ground. These columns average around 5 tons each, with some estimated as heavy as 50 tons, and they had to cross open reef and lagoon water for dozens of kilometers before being lifted into walls that still stand. There is no metal at the site, no pulleys, no wheel, No draft animal ever lived on this island to help haul a load, and none ever could have. No island in this ocean had ever supported a horse or an ox or any beast large enough to drag a multi-ton stone, so whatever method existed had to run entirely on human muscle, timber, rope, and the sea itself. The leading scientific hypothesis holds that the columns were floated on rafts, timed to tidal currents, and paddled or towed across the lagoon before being levered into place. In theory, workers would have lashed logs together, balanced a column across them, and let the rising tide carry the load just far enough to walk it through the reef channel over and over for 4 centuries. In practice, nobody has ever built that raft and tried it in real conditions with a real 5-ton stone. Pohnpei's own staff archaeologist, a man named Rufino Mauricio, has said this to researchers from the Smithsonian in the plainest terms available to him. He said that no one has been able to explain how the people of Nan Madol brought the columns to the site, or how they lifted them into place to build the walls. Ask most people to name a mystery built from stone too heavy to move, and they will say Stonehenge, or Easter Island, or the pyramids. Almost nobody says Nan Madol, and yet the puzzle sitting quietly in this lagoon has never been resolved either. It has simply had far fewer visitors around to ask. Over roughly 400 years of construction, the people of Nan Madol moved an estimated 750,000 tons of basalt across that reef, by hand, or by raft, or by some method nobody alive has managed to reconstruct. Spread evenly across 4 centuries, and measured against the typical 5-ton column, that pace works out to something close to 1 multi-ton stone, quarried, floated, and lifted into a wall every single day, for 400 years without pause. That is the detail that should stop you. Not the columns themselves, remarkable as they are, but the number attached to them, and the total silence surrounding how it was ever physically achieved, over and over for 4 centuries, without a single recorded failure large enough to leave a wreck of broken stone behind. Nan Madol's builders never explained how they moved stone that should not have been movable. Barely a few centuries later, and half a world away, in the mountains of northern China, another civilization was quietly solving the opposite problem. Instead of hauling immovable rock across open water, they were figuring out how to raise a tower taller than almost anything else around it, built from a material every modern engineer will tell you should have burned, rotted, or shaken to pieces within 100 years. It has instead stood for very nearly 1,000, without a single nail holding it together. Number 3. The Wooden Pagoda of Yingxian. In a small county town in Shaanxi Province, China, stands a tower roughly the height of a 20-story building, built entirely of wood, held together without a single nail, that has outlived earthquakes, warlords, and modern gunfire for very nearly 1,000 years. The tower was completed in the year 1056, during the Liao dynasty, inside the grounds known today as Fogong Temple. Chroniclers disagree on exactly who paid for it, some crediting Empress Dowager Xiao, others crediting Emperor Daozong, and no surviving record settles the argument cleanly, so both names deserve mention rather than one being declared the true patron. Whichever ruler it truly was, that person commanded enormous resources to attempt a building this ambitious. The building sits only on the world's tentative heritage list, awaiting room for full recognition that, more than a decade on, still has not arrived. Picture 5 visible stories stacked above the ground, with 4 more hidden levels tucked between them for structural support, climbing to a little over 67 meters, weighing an estimated 7,400 tons. Every joint is carved wood meeting carved wood, roughly 80,000 mortise and tenon joints in total, locked together by 54 distinct types of interlocking wooden brackets in a system called dugong. Picture arms of timber fanning outward from each column like the ribs of a fan, spreading the crushing weight of the roof outward and down instead of letting it collapse straight through the frame. Not one nail, not one metal bolt, just wood shaped to hold wood. Rigid structures resist a force until, all at once, they reach their limit and they crack. Flexible ones sway, absorb, and settle back into place, which is close to the behavior engineers now believe the dugong brackets were built to allow, joint by joint, centuries before anyone wrote down the physics of why it worked. That bracket system is also, as far as anyone can tell, the reason the tower is still standing at all. Timber structures are not supposed to survive 1,000 years, let alone in a region prone to earthquakes. Popular retellings sometimes pin the tower's survival to one dramatic, named earthquake, but the confirmed record does not tie its condition to any single dated event. What the tower actually survived was centuries of them, plural, on top of a far more modern trial. During warfare that ran from the 1920s through the 1940s, the tower absorbed bullet and shell strikes, and the scars are still visible in the timber today. Splintered wood that was never replaced, only left standing. Carved brackets that once framed the eaves in delicate, repeating fans now carry gouges and punctures alongside their carving, centuries of devotion, and a few decades of modern warfare sitting side by side in the same beams. A peer-reviewed engineering paper, published in 2017 by the Institution of Civil Engineers, studied exactly how the semi-rigid give in those dugong joints seems to have let the whole frame flex and absorb shock instead of shattering, and the paper is, quite literally, titled as an attempt at solving the mystery of this exact pagoda. That is not a settled answer. That is the title of an open question, still being argued by structural engineers today. Here is the detail that should stay with you. The column holding up the second floor of this exact tower, the one that shrugged off centuries of earthquakes and round after round of gunfire, is right now leaning 57 centimeters out of true vertical. The upper floors have been closed to visitors for more than a decade now. And for more than 2 decades, the conservation engineers responsible for this building have not been able to agree on how to fix that lean. Some argue for full dismantling and a complete rebuild. Others want only targeted reinforcement, left mostly as it stands. A few argue for building an entire full-scale replica first, just to test repair methods on a tower that does not matter, before anyone touches the one that does. And that is the most disturbing part of this story, more than the lean itself. The same semi-rigid joints that let this tower breathe and flex through 1,000 years of earthquakes and warfare are the very joints that specialists are now afraid to tighten. Stiffen the frame to correct the lean, and they may remove the exact give that kept the whole structure alive this long. Leave it alone, and gravity keeps pulling that column further from true, 1 century at a time. Nobody wants to be the engineer who fixes one problem and kills the building doing it. Yingxian's builders learned a lesson that took Europe centuries longer to accept. Sometimes the only way to survive a great force pressing down on you is to bend under it, instead of fighting it head-on. Not long after the last timber went up on this pagoda, on the other side of the world, in the cool gray light of northern France, another set of medieval builders would attempt the opposite approach entirely, raising the tallest vaulted stone ceiling in the history of Gothic architecture, and refusing, on principle, to let a single inch of it bend. Engineers are still arguing about exactly why that decision ended with the roof on the floor. Number 2. Beauvais Cathedral. In the town of Beauvais, in the region of Picardy in northern France, stands the choir of a cathedral that was never allowed to become what it was built to be. Construction began in 1225 after fire had gutted the old church under a bishop named Milon de Nantuil. But this was never going to be an ordinary rebuilding. The men behind it were chasing a record. Under the bishop who came after him, Guillaume de Grez, the The plans were changed partway through construction, and the walls were pushed roughly 5 meters higher than first designed. Not for worship, not for structural need, for height. Beauvais wanted to build the tallest ceiling Christendom had ever raised toward its God. Picture the scene once that roof finally closed at the first Mass ever said beneath it in 1272. The vault above the choir stood at roughly 47.5 meters, taller than a modern 15-story building, held up by nothing but cut stone and geometry. The tallest vault anywhere else on Earth at the time, at the Cathedral of Amiens, stopped at 42 meters. Beauvais did not just build a cathedral, it built the ceiling of the sky itself, and for 12 years it held. Then, on the 29th of November, in the year 1284, the sky came down. The vault of the choir collapsed. Stone that had stood for barely a generation crashed into the space below, where priests had chanted Mass only years before. And here is where the case turns strange, because the people who caused the failure were also the first to investigate it, and even they could not fully explain what had happened. When the medieval builders rebuilt the vault, they doubled the number of intermediate supports holding it up, which tells you their own working theory. Not enough support. But doubling a number is not the same as understanding a cause, and more than 7 centuries later, engineers still cannot agree on what actually brought the tallest vault in the Gothic world down. A rigorous review of the case, published in 2025 in the peer-reviewed journal Heritage, is direct about it. No broad consensus among historians of architecture and structural engineers has ever been reached about the cause of the collapse, despite decades of competing hypotheses. 2 of those hypotheses still stand against each other today. One study, published in 1976, built physical scale models out of photoelastic material to study stress patterns, and concluded that wind striking a specific weak point, where the supporting buttresses failed to line up correctly, caused a slow fatigue crack to spread through the stone until it gave way. A second study, published in 2009, argues instead for creep buckling, the idea that the piers themselves, cut too thin in the reach for height, were silently bending under their own sustained weight for years, wind or no wind at all. 2 opposing explanations, and nobody has ever disproven either one enough to settle the question. But the detail that should stay with you is not the argument. It is what happened afterward, 700 years afterward. During a structural survey conducted in the 1990s, engineers examining the cathedral's transept found that its piers had physically leaned out vertical by up to 30 centimeters. Not cracked, not fallen, leaning slowly, the way a tree leans before it finally comes down. Workers responded by installing emergency props of wood and steel inside the nearly 800-year-old building, bracing the stone from within like a patient kept on life support. Those props stayed in place for roughly 3 decades. Sensors capable of gathering enough data to judge whether the props could safely be removed were only installed in 2014. Active government restoration work did not begin until 2022, and the project was expected to run for years beyond that. Sit with that timeline for a moment. The tallest Gothic vault ever attempted has spent most of living memory standing on scaffolding bolted in place by 20th century engineers, because nobody has ever been fully certain the stone can hold itself up alone. This is not a mystery locked away in some distant century. It is a mystery wearing a hard hat, still being propped, inside a working cathedral, where Mass is still said, beneath a ceiling that once fell out of the sky without warning. And this is the part worth sitting with. Every civilization runs into the edge of what it knows how to build. Most stop before they hit it. Beauvais did not stop. It reached past that edge on purpose twice. First with the vault, and then, 3 centuries later, when the tower and spire raised over the crossing, briefly the tallest structure anywhere on the planet at close to 150 meters, came down as well in 1573. Twice, this building told its own builders exactly where the limit was. And twice, human ambition looked at that limit and kept building anyway. The nave of Beauvais Cathedral, the part that should have completed the whole structure, was simply never built at all. To this day, a fragment of the older, 10th century church still stands fused directly onto the Gothic transept, holding open the gap where the rest of the building should be, like a sentence that was never allowed to finish. Beauvais fell because it reached too high for its own century, but at least we know, in general terms, what happened to it. Stone met its limit and stone lost. Our final case is stranger than that and darker still, because nothing there ever collapsed at all. Nothing broke. Nothing fell in the night for anyone to explain. Instead, right beside the most visited medieval monument left standing anywhere on this planet, sits a structure that was finished exactly as planned, that never failed a single test of engineering, and whose entire purpose scientists still cannot explain at all. Number 1. Angkor Wat. In Siem Reap province in Cambodia stands the largest religious monument ever built by human hands, and beside it, in plain sight of every visitor who has ever walked its causeway, sits a mystery that modern science has openly admitted it cannot solve. The temple itself was raised under King Sacsayhuamán II, roughly between 1113 and 1150, at the height of the Khmer Empire. But Angkor Wat was never a lone building. It was one temple inside a vast engineered city, a network of reservoirs, canals, and moats spread across an area of roughly 1,000 square kilometers, built and expanded over some 4 centuries, from the 9th century through the 13th. In 1992, the whole complex was named a World Heritage Site, one of the most recognized ruins on the surface of the Earth. For a long time, that hydraulic city was itself the mystery. How did a medieval kingdom move that much stone, manage that much water, feed that many people? Modern tools have answered almost all of it. Airborne laser surveys flown over the jungle canopy in 2012 and 2015 mapped the entire network in a level of detail no ground survey ever could. Even the logistics of the sandstone were solved. A study conducted in those same years traced the quarries in the hills to the north and found a purpose-built canal stretching some 35 kilometers, along which workers floated rafts loaded with blocks weighing 1.5 tons each, delivering them straight to the temple site. Angkor kept almost none of its practical secrets from a determined modern investigation, which is exactly why what was found just south of the temple's moat is so hard to explain away. The same laser survey that mapped the reservoirs also revealed 6 enormous earthworks, each one laid out in a tight, deliberate spiral, and each one roughly 10 times the size of a football field. They were built from raised embankments of packed sand, 18 meters wide, separated by narrow canals 12 meters across, coiling in on themselves again and again. They appear to date from around Sacsayhuamán II's own reign, the 12th century, raised by the same civilization at the same time, using the same engineering skill that built the temple itself. And then, as far as anyone can tell, they were simply left, never finished, never used. Ground teams excavated them in the years following the laser survey, expecting to find what you would expect at the site of months of organized human labor: tools left behind, cooking fires, broken pottery, the ordinary debris people leave behind after living or working somewhere for any length of time. They found none of it, not one shard of pottery, not one tool, not one fire pit. The excavators opened structures that had taken hundreds of laborers months to build, and inside there was only clean, undisturbed sand. Whatever these spirals were for, no one ever seems to have moved in, worked there, or worshipped there long enough to leave a single trace of themselves behind. The 2 archaeologists who led that research, Damien Evans and Roland Fletcher, published their findings in the academic journal Antiquity in 2015, and neither man hedged. Fletcher said plainly that quite how the spirals functioned is not at all clear, and that nothing like their shape and design has been seen anywhere else. Evans, describing the wider site around them, said its function remains unknown, with no known equivalent anywhere else in the Angkorian world. Every explanation proposed since, a ceremonial garden, a decorative pleasure garden built in imitation of later royal palaces, an engineering project abandoned before completion, remains exactly that, proposed. Not one of them has ever been confirmed. It is worth being honest about what is and is not settled here. Historians do still argue, seriously and productively, about how much of Angkor's wider water network was built for irrigation, how much for flood control, and how much purely for religious display. And they argue just as seriously about whether a run of severe droughts in the 14th and 15th centuries broke the system and doomed the empire, or whether administrative decline had already set in decades earlier, and the drought simply finished what neglect had started. Those are real, live scholarly debates, and they deserve to stay open questions rather than settled facts. But none of that is the strangest thing about Angkor. The strangest thing is not a debate about causes. It is 6 shapes in the earth that nobody has ever been able to name a purpose for at all. Think about what that actually means. This is not some forgotten ruin buried under unbroken jungle, waiting for the first archaeologist brave enough to reach it. Angkor Wat is, by most counts, the single most visited medieval structure left standing anywhere on this planet. Millions of people walk within a few hundred meters of these spirals every single year. Scholars have mapped this site with lasers, with satellites, with ground-penetrating radar, and with decades of careful excavation. And still, right beside the most photographed religious building on Earth is a set of structures that took a small army of medieval laborers months to build, for a purpose that not one modern expert has ever been able to name. That is the real shock underneath this entire list. It is not that some crumbling, forgotten corner of the medieval world keeps its secrets. It is that even the most famous, most studied, most photographed monument left from that entire age still has a locked room sitting in full daylight beside its front door. After laser scans, ground surveys, and years of dedicated research, the honest answer from the very scientists who dug it up is still just this: we do not know. 10 buildings. 10 times someone built past what their own century knew how to do, then vanished without leaving the instructions behind. A mosque still eroding out of living coral. A bridge no builder ever signed. A ceiling of stone fanned like lace, holding weight it should not. A wooden tower raised without one nail. A wall cut so precisely a blade will not pass between the stones. A leaning cathedral still held up by 20th century steel. And beside the most famous temple left on this earth, a shape cut into the sand that the people who dug it up are still honest enough to admit they cannot explain.
Yep.
Different centuries, different continents, different reasons, same ending. They reached past what their own age knew how to build, and the proof is still standing long after the builders and their reasons are gone. Most people read a plaque like that and keep walking. You just watched all 10. That already makes you a different kind of viewer. So pick one. Of all 10, which one do you think holds the real, unsolved mystery? Say which and defend it in the comments. And if 10 unanswered questions were not enough, subscribe, because history left plenty more of these behind, and we intend to keep opening them.